Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today we're diving into the moment that changes everything. Ni makes James seal a pinky promise no more disappearing, and Diep has to decide if she can trust him again. If you enjoy this kind of emotional, long-form story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The bus station kept moving, engines roaring, people rushing, announcements crackling overhead. But for James, everything shrank to one small circle. Diep's tight grip on a bag, Nye's wide eyes, and the fragile okay Diep had finally given him. James didn't celebrate. He just let out a slow breath. "Thank you," he said, quiet, "for not giving up." Diep's eyes were still glossy, but her voice stayed controlled. "Don't thank me yet. Just don't make me regret it." James nodded. "I won't." Nye tugged Diep's sleeve. "Ms. Diep, are we going?" Diep tightened her arm around Nye's shoulders and looked at James like she was waiting for proof. James crouched in front of Nye. "Hey, little star. How about we don't go anywhere right now? How about we get something warm to eat?" Nye blinked. "Eat?" "Yeah," James said with a small smile. "Something that makes your tummy happy." Nye's eyes darted to Diep for permission. Diep hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Nye relaxed a little, then asked very seriously, "Uncle James, you won't disappear again, right?" James's smile froze for a heartbeat. He glanced at Diep, then back at Nye. "I'm here," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." Nye shook her head. "No. Promise. Like, for real." Diep smoothed Nye's hair, but her eyes stayed on James, silent and demanding. James swallowed. "Okay," he said. "How do you want me to promise?" Nye lifted her smallest finger. "Pinky promise." James hooked his pinky with hers, careful, like the gesture mattered. "I promise," he said, steady. "No more disappearing. If I ever have to go somewhere, I tell you and Ms. Diep first, and I come back." Nye squeezed hard. "You can't break it." "I won't," James said. "Never." Nye threw her arms around him so fast it almost knocked the air out of his lungs. James closed his eyes and held her, guilt and relief mixing in his chest. Diep watched, lips trembling. She turned her face slightly, but James still saw the tears she didn't want him to see. They didn't leave the station in a dramatic rush. James carried the bag Diep had packed. Diep held Nye's hand, and for the first time in a long time, the three of them walked in the same direction. A small cafe near the station was simple. Plastic chairs, steaming bowls, the smell of broth cutting through the cold air. Not fancy, but warm. Nye sat between them, slurping noodles with a seriousness that made James smile despite himself. Diep barely touched her food at first. Her shoulders stayed tense, like she was waiting for the next blow. James didn't push. He just poured her tea and stayed present. Small actions that said, "I'm here." After a few minutes, Nye leaned toward Diep and whispered, "Ms. Diep, are we okay now?" Diep blinked, surprised by how direct it was. She forced a smile. "Well, we're okay, sweetheart." Nye looked at James. "You're okay too?" James nodded. "I'm okay because you're here." Nye grinned like she'd fixed the whole world. Then the bell over the cafe door jingled. Diep tensed on instinct. James glanced toward the entrance. It was Mrs. Huyen. She stepped inside in a neat coat, calm and composed, scanning the room until she found them. Diep stiffened, half standing. James lightly touched Diep's wrist, gentle, reassuring, then stood. "Mom," James said. Mrs. Huyen's eyes moved first to Nye, softening immediately. "Nye," she said warmly. "There you are." Nye smiled. "Hi, Ms. Huyen." Mrs. Huyen leaned down a little. "Did you eat? Are you cold?" Nye shook her head. cheeks full. "I'm eating." Mrs. Huyen chuckled, then looked at Diep. Diep looked like she didn't know whether to bow, apologize, or disappear. "Diep," Mrs. Huyen said gently. "Sit. Don't stand up like you're in trouble." Diep hesitated. You're not," Mrs. Huyen said, firm but kind. "You've been taking care of Nai. I'm grateful." Diep's eyes widened. Grateful wasn't the word she expected. Mrs. Huyen pulled a chair close and sat with them like it was normal. No distance, no coldness, just presence. James watched Diep's shoulders loosen by a fraction. Mrs. Huyen spoke calmly. "James told me enough to know he scared you, and he knows he was wrong to leave you in the dark." She looked at Diep. "I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to make sure you and the child are okay." Diep blinked hard, trying to hold herself together. Nai leaned toward Mrs. Huyen and announced proudly, "Uncle James promised. Pinky promise." Mrs. Huyen glanced at James. "Did you?" James nodded. "I did." "Good," Mrs. Huyen said. Then, to Diep, softer, "If you ever feel alone, you can call me. Don't carry everything by yourself." Diep's lips parted. She couldn't find words. James reached across the table and took Diep's hand. Not sudden, not possessive, just honest. Diep stiffened for a moment, then let her fingers relax into his. "I'm sorry," James said, voice low, "for disappearing, for letting you and Nai carry the fear, for making you feel like running was the only way to survive." Diep's throat tightened. She tried to answer, but her voice caught. James squeezed her hand gently. "From now on, I'll spend more time with you both, not just when things are on fire. Every day. The small moments, too. I'll show up." He kept his voice calm, like he was making a vow to the table itself. "No more excuses," he added. "I'll be there for breakfast, for school drop-offs, for the boring errands. If I'm late, you'll know why. If I'm scared, I'll say it. I don't want you guessing anymore." Across from them, Mrs. Huyen watched in silence. She didn't interrupt. Ni kept eating, smiling to herself. And for a moment, it really did feel like the world had clicked into place. But when James smiled back, his eyes still held worry. Happiness was real, but it was fragile. He could feel storms waiting somewhere beyond the door. "Let's go home," he said softly. "All of us." Diep looked up, torn between wanting to believe and being afraid to hope. Then she nodded, small, careful, real, and they sat there a little longer, holding on to the calm, knowing the sky could change at any time. The apartment was quiet in that fragile way. Quiet because everyone was afraid to make the wrong sound and break the moment. Ni sat cross-legged on the bed with her stuffed toy, hair a little messy, eyes bright like she'd been saving up happiness. James stood near the doorway, still wearing that tired look, but softer now, like he'd finally come back inside himself. Diep hovered by the small table, hands busy for no reason, straightening something that didn't need straightening. She kept stealing glances at James, checking if he was really here. Nai slid off the bed and walked straight to James like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Uncle James," she said, voice serious. James crouched immediately. "Yeah, little star?" Nai opened her arms. James didn't hesitate. He let her crash into him. The hug was tight and unfiltered, the kind that didn't care about adult pride or complicated history. Diep's breath caught. She turned her face away, but the emotion still showed in the way her shoulders lifted. Nai pulled back just enough to look at James's face. "You can't disappear again." James's smile wavered. He swallowed. "I won't." Nai shook her head hard. "No. Promise." Diep's gaze snapped to James, silent and sharp. She didn't say a word, but the request was the same. "Don't say it unless you mean it." James nodded slowly. "Okay, how do we do a real promise?" Nye lifted her smallest finger. "Pinky, promise." James held out his hand. Nye hooked her pinky around his with full concentration, like she was tying a knot that couldn't be undone. "I promise," James said, voice low and steady. "No more disappearing. If I ever have to go somewhere, I tell you and Ms. Diep first. And I come back." Nye squeezed his finger with surprising strength. "You can't break it." "I won't," James said. "Never." Nye hugged him again. Quick, fierce, satisfied. James closed his eyes, holding her like he was trying to return every day he'd missed. Diep watched, eyes shimmering. The sight of Nye trusting him so openly hit her in a place she'd been protecting for too long. James stood up slowly, still keeping one hand on Nye's shoulder like he didn't want to lose contact. He looked at Diep. Diep tried to hold her expression steady, but her eyes betrayed her. Tired, soft, scared to hope. James took a step closer. His voice stayed gentle. "Diep, I'm sorry." Diep's lips parted, but nothing came. "I'm sorry for disappearing," James continued, "for making you carry the fear, for making you feel like you had to handle everything alone." Diep's throat tightened. "Saying sorry doesn't erase it." "I know," James said. "That's why I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm asking you to let me earn it." Diep looked away, blinking hard. "And if I can't?" James didn't argue. "Then I keep showing up anyway," he said quietly, "because you and I deserve that." He reached for her hand, slowly, not possessive, not demanding. Diep hesitated for one heartbeat, then let him hold it. James's fingers tightened gently like he was anchoring himself. "From now on," he said, "I'll spend more time with you both. Not just when things are on fire. Every day. The boring errands too. Breakfast, school runs. Even if it's just sitting here doing nothing." Diep's eyes lowered to their joined hands. The tension in her shoulders loosened a fraction. Nye looked between them, satisfied. "So, we're a family now." Diep's breath caught. James answered first, calm but firm. "We've always been," he said. "Or, we just forgot how to stand together." Nye grinned and climbed back onto the bed, humming to herself like the world had finally clicked into place. James guided Diep toward the couch, still holding her hand. "Sit," he said softly. "Just for a minute." Diep sat, stiff at first. James sat beside her, leaving a respectful space, like he was giving her room to breathe. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was Nye rustling with her toy and the distant noise of neighbors outside. Then, Diep whispered, "I'm scared." James nodded without hesitation. "Me too." Diep turned toward him, eyes searching. "What are you scared of?" James looked at Nye, then back at Diep. His voice dropped. "I'm scared that the happiness we have right now is the calm before something bigger," he admitted. "I'm scared because I finally have something I can't lose." Diep's eyes filled. She hated that she understood him. "So, what do we do?" she asked. James squeezed her hand gently. "We hold on to this," he said, "and we get ready without letting fear ruin today." Diep swallowed. "How do we get ready?" "Small steps," James said. "Safer routines. Better communication. No more secrets. If anything feels off, you tell me. If I feel pressure, I tell you. We don't let silence be the place where fear grows." Diep nodded slowly, absorbing it. James added, "And I'll keep my promises, not with big words, by being here, consistently." Diep's voice shook. "What if you can't?" James didn't flinch. "Then you call me out," he said, and I fix it. I don't run. Diep stared at him, the wall inside her shaking. She didn't fully trust him yet, but she wanted to. Nice suddenly turned and held up her hand. "Uncle James, Pinky again." James laughed quietly, the sound surprised out of him. He lifted his pinky and let her hook it again and again, like she was sealing the promise into every hour of the day. Diep watched, and something warm, painful but warm, spread through her chest. James looked back at Diep, his eyes gentle. "I'm choosing you," he said. "Both of you." Diep exhaled shakily. "Don't say it if you can't live it." James nodded. "Then watch me live it." He leaned in, not rushing, not trying to erase the past with romance, just resting his forehead lightly against hers for a brief second. Grounding. Honest. Diep closed her eyes, letting herself feel it. Then she opened them and saw the worry still hiding behind his calm. "You're thinking about what's coming," she said. James's faint smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah." Diep's throat tightened. "And you still want to do this?" James looked at Nee, who had already curled up with her toy, and then back at Diep. "I want to do this because of what's coming," he said quietly. "Not in spite of it." Outside, a siren passed far away and faded. Inside, the room stayed warm, small, safe, for now. James held Diep's hand a little tighter, not because he believed storms wouldn't come, but because for the first time, he was choosing not to face them alone.
Trở về nhà, James chọn cách hòa giải và cố gắng hàn gắn những gì mình đã phá vỡ, như chạy đến ôm chầm lấy anh và đòi một lời hứa thực sự, không còn biến mất nữa. Cô bắt James hứa bằng cách dùng ngón tay út kẹp chặt lấy tay cô, lặp đi lặp lại như một nghi lễ cho đến khi cô cảm thấy an toàn. Diệp lặng lẽ chứng kiến khoảnh khắc đó, xúc động đến thực sự tin tưởng tuyệt đối của Nhi, bàng hoàng trước việc cô vẫn muốn tin tưởng James đến thế nào. James trực tiếp xin lỗi Diệp đã bỏ mặc cô một mình trong nỗi sợ hãi và áp lực, và anh hứa sẽ có mặt trong những khoảnh khắc thường nhật, bữa sáng, đưa đón con đi học và những đêm yên tĩnh ở nhà. Diệp thừa nhận mình sợ hãi và James cũng thừa nhận anh cũng vậy, cảnh báo rằng những cơn bão vẫn có thể ập đến. Tuy nhiên anh vẫn công khai lựa chọn họ, nắm tay Diệp và yêu cầu cô chứng minh điều đó.